Well, good morning, church. Thank you for joining us for our daily Devo. Today, we're in 2 Kings chapter 17, which I believe is one of the saddest chapters of the entire Old Testament. But to make sense, I need to give us some context. I'll try to go through it quickly, but I'll be covering 200 years of history. At the end of Solomon's reign, Israel was at an all-time high. Their territory, their prominence, the fact they built a temple, people were coming from around the world to see it. They had more power than they'd ever had before, so they were at a high water mark. Unfortunately, Solomon, their king, was personally at a low water mark. He had disobeyed God in so many ways, but one of the ways he did the most was marrying foreign women. At this time, he had over 700 wives, many of them connected to foreign nations, and 300 concubines. And when he married them, what he did was disobey God, and God had that law. He had that command for a reason, and he was worried that these women from other nations would bring in false worship that would pull the hearts of the people and the king away from him, and that's exactly what happened. Solomon starts participating in the most pagan of worships, and he goes from being a young man just after God and praying for wisdom to someone who really turned his back on God. So at the end of his life, the kingdom splits. It splits into two nations. One is the northern nations, which from that point on is called Israel, and it's made up of 10 tribes, and the southern nation, which is made up of 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin. So it's just called, throughout the Old Testament, Judah. It refers to Judah. It's talking about the southern tribes that occupied Jerusalem. And when it talks about Israel, it's talking to the northern 10 tribes. Well, the first king was Jeroboam, and Jeroboam had a real issue. He was worried that the people of the northern tribes would come, they would obey the Pentateuch, the first 5 laws, they would participate in the worship in Jerusalem, which is in the southern kingdom, they would be in the feast that would happen in Jerusalem, and they would be involved in the sacrifices. And he was worried their hearts would be turned back, and they would allow the nation to be reunited and his kingdom would be lost. So he does a really horrible thing. He has them build 2 golden calves, and he brings the people together and he says, "These are the gods that freed you from Egypt. Worship them." Man, that's incredible he would do that. And then what happens is he sets up places of worship in the north. He ordains priests to lead this worship that were not part of the tribe of Levi. And from that point on, the northern 10 tribes go into a false worship. They've done everything God's commanded them not to do, and they turn their back on God. And as we read in 2 Kings chapter 17, we are now 200 years in that history. In 200 years, there have been 20 kings, and all 20 kings in the northern tribes have been wicked. Whereas in the southern tribe, there's been wicked kings, and when they were wicked, God punished the nation. There's been righteous kings, and God blessed the nation. But in the nation, the northern Israel, the northern tribes, there's been 20 kings in 200 years, all wicked, all evil, all defiling God. And God was patient. To me, it was as God was looking down, and for 200 years having grace that they could turn back to Him, that they could again walk away from the false worship and follow Him, but they never do. And it's like at the end of those 200 years, God draws a line. He allows the nation of Assyria to come and capture the northern 10 tribes. And Assyria did something so much different than other nations, because nations would conquer nations and those nations might rebel back and take back control. But Assyria had a technique that was absolutely perfect in causing that not to happen. And so they took a large portion of the nation of Israel, those northern tribes, and they moved them to another occupied land where they had to go and live. They didn't have a choice. It was that or die. And they brought in all these people from other occupied lands that then lived in Israel. And what happened? Over time, these people intermarried. They lost their nationalism, and so they wouldn't rebel against Assyria because now they didn't have the commonality they once had. As a matter of fact, these people become the Samaritans, and it's one of the reasons the Jews hated the Samaritans so much is because they had turned their back on God and they had assimilated with other nations, and they were worshiping God not in Jerusalem but in these other places of worship, and it created this. And I think if you look at this, we see 2 things. We see the incredible grace of God. God that was waiting for 200 years for a nation to turn back to Him. Kind of like in the New Testament, the story of the prodigal son, where the father waited for the prodigal son to return night after night. Finally, he comes back and he welcomes him back in. But unlike the prodigal son, the nation of Israel never turned back to God. So God drew a line. And to this day, if you are a Jew, you trace your lineage back to Judah or Benjamin, because the other 10 tribes are called the lost tribes of Israel. They were totally assimilated. So I find it so sad that God for 200 years patiently waits for the nation to repent. And finally here in 2 Kings chapter 17, God draws the line of judgment on the nation, and it's really assimilated. It disappears as a nation. Those 10 tribes are gone. I think it encourages us, one, to know that God's grace is there, that we can turn back, but also know there's a line. There's that point in which, there is judgment for what we do. And so, guys, if we're walking away from God, if we're going in the wrong place, let's turn back to Him. Let's not take for granted God's grace.